Hello everyone and welcome to our final week for lecture videos. This is our 15th week essentially, and this is a first of two final videos. This is the last part of chapter 9 for advanced exercise physiology for Kin 416 at Concordia University for the spring semester. And then we'll cover chapter 10 and just a touch upon 11, the last chapter in the book. Chapter 11 will not be tested. It's just information we want to cover a little bit of, just for a little bit of content there at the end of our lecture video for Wednesday's class, essentially. And that video will be posted at some point on Wednesday, preferably Tuesday, but possibly on Wednesday. And that being said, like so many things, all the content that we have, you cover as much content as you can, and then ultimately there's a lot more to be covered. Whenever I've taken any course, there's always the textbook, and there's what you can cover within the textbook, because each chapter of the textbook could easily become a course in itself, and even there are sections in each chapter which could become courses in themselves. So there should always be a level of expectation or thought process that, oh, there's so much more. Yes. I have so many more questions. Yes. Right? The more you know, ultimately, the more questions you have. That's actually a good thing. So when you have no questions, it either means you know it all or you don't know enough, right? That being said, let's talk about our second part of our chapter for chapter 9, environmental stressors, genetics, nutrition, and ergogenic aids are our primary content areas for today. Excuse me, I can drink water again already. That being said, so as we talk about some questions we had or our content areas based upon some things you were noting in your discussion board posts. One question, what's the best determinant for extreme concern with being obese or overweight? The best determinant for determining whether there's extreme concern to be had is probably doing the waist circumference. There's all sorts of measurements we can use for the basic recognition of whether someone's overweight or obese, and the waist size is probably of greatest significance from a general standpoint, assuming we don't have easy access to getting an MRI or to getting a DEXA test or hydrostatic weighing. Those kinds of things give us more of an accurate measurement. But the greater issue from a general standpoint is the recognition of the visceral fat in the midsection, and if the waist size for the man is above 0.9 ratio waist to hip, or if it's above 0.85 for the women, generally speaking. Okay. That said, why do diet programs fail? Mostly because people just don't adhere to them. You could follow almost anything from a basic behavioral modification for making better behavior choices, from a standpoint of lifestyle, from a standpoint of diet and or exercise, and preferably all of the above, of course. Exercise being the biggest factor for increasing metabolism. The other factors simply can lower your metabolic rate by having less calories in, or lower your stress levels, which are also very vital and important, but only exercise increases the metabolism, which is why it's the best focus point for longer term health and welfare beyond just nutrition and behavior modifications for lifestyle and sleep and whatnot. That said, they fail because people don't stick with them for at least 6 months or more. That seems to be pretty consistent with the expectation of time for expecting to be able to maintain your set point, your basic weight for any lengthy period of time, is making sure that you are maintaining a program for at least 6 months or more. And you should be able to maintain that same program you're doing currently. So if someone's engaged in a program of any kind, and specifically we're talking mostly toward exercise, but any relative program that helps lose weight, and they're only going to do it for a short period of time, why would they expect to keep the weight off? You have to be engaging in a program that you can maintain for the long term, for years. Why would you do something? Why would anyone do anything, from my professional opinion here, you can only do for a few months? You don't get a kickstart and all of a sudden you can sit back. And believe me, there are many people out there, as a personal trainer, as a coach, as a teacher, education wise, from a standpoint of just general fitness population or athletes. A lot of people, lesser toward the athletes, but a lot of people feel they can reach a certain point of health and wellness and fitness and performance, and they can just kind of shut it down a little bit and turn off the engines, like you're coasting or something, like you're gliding or coasting downhill. And it doesn't work like that at all. It's always a slight uphill, no matter what you do. So if you slow down, you're going to eventually start going backward. You will eventually, maybe sooner rather than later. Probably a very slight incline is probably a very apt way of putting it in terms of someone who's pretty fit. And if it's a significant incline when someone's really out of shape, such that the person who is, I wish I used this analogy before, I really like this analogy, and now I just thought of it. I'm sure I'm not the first person to ever think of it, but right now it's kind of a ding, I just thought of it. If you're really out of shape, when you start to exercise and engage in new behaviors, you're essentially going up a significantly steep uphill, right? So someone who then ceases their behaviors slides downhill fast, whereas someone who's been engaging in regular behaviors, that hill begins to come to more of a level plane, except there's always a slight incline, such that if you lay off on your positive behaviors, you're still going to start sliding backward and lose progress. It just won't happen as fast. You won't get going with such momentum backward, but you will go backward, right? That's actually a great analogy. I really like that one. That being said, so true of any program. But the exercise and diet programs in particular, people don't stay with them long enough. They need the support systems in place, which means usually people who are there to continually check in with them on a regular basis to keep making sure the programs stay on course. Dramatic reductions in caloric intake are a bad idea. Simply put, a bad idea. It doesn't mean that in some extreme situations when someone's life is threatened from a standpoint of health and they're going to do drastic things trying to get them back under significant, close, preferably 24/7 supervision for someone going on some drastic diet to get them away from some severe health issue, that's a different thing. From a general perspective, when the book notes lowering your caloric intake 500 to 1,000 calories below your resting metabolic rate is a possible recognition standpoint for caloric intake for trying to lose weight, I'm going to question that if the expectation is also to be adding exercise there, which should be the expectation. Your body's meant to move. No one should be questioning that after taking this course. The body's meant to move every day. You don't exercise 3 days a week. 3 days a week is for people who don't exercise at all and need to start somewhere. For everybody else, it's 7 days a week. That's the goal. That's where we need to be, right? That being said, the best course of action is every day focus on diet and exercise and making it a lifestyle change. Weight loss surgeries can work, just like anything can work. The concern with weight loss surgeries is that you've ultimately changed someone's body, and there's a risk there for the health of the person from what they're going internally and being invasive and basically affecting internal organs and decreasing size of them, specifically the stomach usually. That being said, it's sketchy if that's going to be maintaining anything. Short-term positive results, if people stay with the positive behaviors that they need to be engaging now, they can keep the weight off the rest of their lives. But the stomach can grow again, and some of the, basically all the surgery that has been performed can be, I wouldn't say reversed, but your body can change and adapt to stress. So people can gain the weight back anyway if they don't engage in proper exercise habits, diet habits, and behavior modifications. So the key factor is finding something that someone can continue for the rest of their lives. That's the key factor here. And what's a reasonable level weekly weight loss? 1 to 2 pounds per week muscle or fat expectation of gain or loss, but you can lose probably by like 3 pounds-ish or even a little more for someone who's really overweight in the early stages, but 1 to 2 pounds on a regular basis is pretty phenomenal. And you can't lose or gain more than 1 or 2 pounds of muscle or fat in a given week. How do we adapt to hot or cold environments to optimize performance? We talked about acclimation or acclimatization, 2 different ways of referring to it, and I'm okay with whichever way you refer to it because there's different textbooks on exercise physiology. Disagree on the terminology usage here. That being said, a few days is just getting you ready for adapting to current stressors. It's not going to be maintained once you leave that stress, that heat or that cold, and go back to normal within a few days. You're back to normal response to stress. If you want to really get used to it, it's going to take you months and years to fully become used to it, whereby you can leave for a couple weeks, come back, it's not a big deal. But a few days at least of gradually increasing stress to your normal levels of stress from a standpoint of exercise performance. Obviously, we need to warm up for longer periods and cool down for longer periods in extreme cold, and warm up and cool down for shorter periods, 3 to 5 minutes, when it's also really, really warm. That's a very big generalization there, but some important factors that we need to note there. Altitude. Key variables we have to be aware of: elevation, as we rise in elevation, understanding differences in barometric pressure, percent of oxygen, partial pressure of oxygen, and typical temperatures. At sea level, basically no altitude really, 1,640 feet or less. Miami is used as an example here, and you'll see some references here. For those of you who took me into KIN 406, you'll just look very similar. These numbers are just taken straight from content from our previous text, and it's consistent with our text, with Erman text as well. But that said, the barometric pressure is here. We're going to stick with that's normal barometric pressure at sea level right there. Oxygen level is what it always is. When we talk about on land, okay? It's always 20.93% oxygen as far as the total gas in the air. And of course, here's your partial pressure of oxygen at sea level, and your temperature, typically speaking, might, as an example, then you see a little bit increase in temperature, in elevation up to about a little over a mile high, like Denver. You see a drop in that barometric pressure. Oxygen percentage is the same as far as percentage of total gas, okay? However, the partial pressure of oxygen has gone down because the barometric pressure total amount is still 20.93% of the 631. Okay, so barometric pressure has changed, so as a consequence, the percent is the same. However, you have less oxygen available. The partial pressure of oxygen has changed because the barometric pressure has changed, because now we're getting less barometric pressure as you go up in elevation. Temperature is, of course, dropping as well, and you'll see that proceeding along those parameters, going into extreme high elevations, talking about something like climbing a very tall mountain like Everest, or there aren't too many mountains that are actually 20,000 feet and above in the world. But that being said, you can see a dramatic difference here in barometric pressure, consequently, dramatic difference in the partial pressure of oxygen, like a third. So you can imagine the amount of how difficult it is to breathe properly, let alone the temperature here, right? That said, solar radiation and altitude, the higher you go up in elevation, the less layers of the atmosphere that are there protect you. So consequently, you're much more susceptible to radiation from the sun and radiation sickness, sunburn. You better believe wearing sunscreen plus 200 or something like that when you're spending significant time at really, really high elevations, or have a good proper ethnic background from a standpoint of people who lived in those populations for centuries, so your body's adapted to such things genetically. That being said, you got to be careful, right? Even slight altitudes can play a big difference for people, let alone going near the equator, which is a whole different thing, not even related to altitude. That said, blood volume and altitude. The plasma decreases by as much as 25%. That's a significant drop in plasma volume. It takes longer for the oxygen diffusion to cross the cell membrane, so consequently you get less oxygen to the tissues as you need them during increased levels of stress. Low to moderate, like moderate end of low to moderate end stress, really doesn't have much bearing upon you from a standpoint of recovery. You feel pretty good, but it will start to affect your performance. There's no question about it at pretty much any level of output that requires oxidative energy supply. So anything you're trying to do for 22 minutes and beyond for lengthier periods, right? Ish. 2 minutes and well beyond. That said, continued exposure to altitude, you're really talking about, honestly, more moderate altitude and above. Okay, when we talk about altitude and you're actually seeing significant differences in your body's response, you'll see some at the high end of low, so to speak, but really it's more in the moderate altitudes and above we start seeing some of these changes with exposure relative to blood volume and in this case specifically EPO. A lot of people do blood doping or EPO. They actually take out their blood and then put it back in, so they have a higher red blood cell content, so they actually have greater oxygen utilization, but it's also very risky from a standpoint of it can really help you with performance dramatically, up to 30% performance improvements in some sports and some endurance events, crazy amounts, right? You imagine how much that can help someone. However, that being said, it's also very dangerous and life-threatening. Not surprising why. That being said, the longer term increase with months, probably more likely your book notes as little as 2 weeks. 3 weeks to 6 weeks seems to be the most typical expectation where you start to see some of these things start to happen, where you have an increase in total blood volume and red blood cells over time, and increased capillary density, decreased blood lactate at submaximal efforts. That's just basically telling you you're able to perform at higher levels of work without going past your lactate threshold, because you're developing that response to this raise in altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen change, and you're actually developing more red blood cells, so you're getting better oxygen utilization. Now, the key thing is that's going to help compensate for that low partial pressure of oxygen, and you're going to have better performances in the short term when you return to sea level. But honestly, within days, certainly within a week or two, if you're talking about someone who hasn't lived their entire lives or for many, many years at altitude, you're going to be losing the benefits of training at altitude if you've only been there for a few weeks or even a couple, 2-3 months. Okay. That being said, your VO2 max, generally speaking, decreases about 3% for every 1,000 feet and elevation above about 5,000 feet. It's a pretty fair estimation. It can vary, but it's a pretty good estimation. Your resting VO2 max levels are about 3.5 milliliters per kilogram. Conditioned climbers, you look at them about at least 62 milliliters per kilogram. That's a pretty good VO2 max. That would make a pretty decent endurance athlete. That said, like elite athletes are more likely in the mid 70s and above, but still, that's a good VO2 max. And that's going to be decreased to about 15 milliliters per kilogram near Everest peak, regardless. So someone who has a high VO2 max, when they go climb Everest, their VO2 max goes to, like, at the moment when they're up there near the peak, 15 milliliters per kilogram. Can you imagine how difficult it is to breathe? If you think about it, or a person who doesn't train much at all and just goes for a walk and gets a little bit of breath going up the stairs, just walking up the stairs and out of breath, and they got to take a break, that person's probably got a VO2 max in the 20s. So you can imagine every step. And if you read books or if you've seen some movies showing people like at Everest and depicting what it's like, and they're walking it super like in slow-mo, and they're it's tremendously stressful. So if you don't start with great VO2 max, it's life-threatening to be at such an elevation, and it's highly recommended to not even consider such things. Okay. That said, would anaerobic or aerobic athletes be expected to peak at increasing altitudes? Well, anaerobic, because aerobic athletes, certainly the longer duration you are undergoing stress from a standpoint of work time at higher intensities, the more your VO2 max is clearly dropping relative to the altitude. So you're going to have less oxygen capacity. Consequently, you're going to drop in performance by 5% or more potentially in some instances. With some people, elite athletes are about 5%-ish. A lot of their 1,500 meters to marathon, the textbook notes that. But the average person is probably much more a drop in actual performance from a standpoint of endurance at altitudes once you start going above 5,000 feet in particular. But anaerobic athletes can see a 1 or 2% gain of improvement due to less resistance from the air as they rise in altitude, like Mexico City, we're about 8,000 feet or so. A lot of the athletes were seeing a slight benefit from maximal speed, maximal power type sports by being at altitude, but they're only going for a few seconds. Once you start getting glycolytic type athletes, or especially endurance type athletes, that performance is going to drop, okay, at least a little bit. And there you have the aerobic athletes, about a 5% drop off from sea level performances. Live high and train high are a variation. Again, a minimum of 3 to 6 weeks living moderate to high, so 6,000 feet or above expectation wise, and training low sea level when you're training at moderately high intensity or higher intensity activity. Some low intensity work at altitude training or even low moderate is fine, but trying to train at high intensity is just probably going to wear people out unless they've been living there for years. It's a different story. Okay, that person who's just trying to get the benefit of staying at altitude for a short period of time should be considering living high, training low for maximal benefit from the altitude, but not stressing the body too much with trying to train at high intensities when the body, basically their immune system, their body's ability to utilize oxygen is greatly diminished. Okay. That said, there are concerns of high altitude sickness, high altitude pulmonary edema, damage to the brain, and cerebral edema, and we have to be very, very cautious. That's why someone needs to have a high VO2 max for pursuing, even hanging out at extreme altitudes, extremely high altitudes, let alone pursuing high intensity activities once you start getting those moderate to higher intensity or higher elevations. Okay. And talking about underwater and microgravity performance very briefly here, it's kind of understanding some things that kind of affect people. Two of the primary challenges, obviously, to underwater performance are the high atmospheric pressure from the water, hyperbaria, and being unable to breathe without assistance. You need scuba, right? Self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Something called an air bolus, like when a scuba diver must exhale before rising from depths as the volume of the air in their lungs increases while they're ascending, and that increased volume can potentially cause the alveolar sacs to rupture, and overextension of lungs can occur in as little as 5 feet for a scuba diver. Okay, that's unusual and rare, but it can occur as little as that, right? That being said, that's why scuba divers must be well trained, must understand they have to exhale properly before rising, have to have at least reasonable cardiovascular capacity to be able to handle such depths and be able to breathe out properly and understand how to control breathing, especially with the pressure of the water the deeper someone goes as well. With alveolar rupture or damage, the free air may be forced into the capillaries. That's forming air and blood emboli, which can restrict blood flow to the heart of the brain. Not a good thing. Along those lines, something called nitrogen narcosis or the bends, decompression sickness, DCS. That's when someone has a deep descent in scuba diving and it creates a significant change in the partial pressure of nitrogen. And that subsequent rapid ascent, if someone comes up too quick, it doesn't blow out all their air properly, nitrogen bubbles form, not nitrogen forms bubble. Nitrogen bubbles form, okay, and gas emboli can form, causing blockages and tissue damage, and ultimately death potentially, and some severe brain damage if someone's not careful and well trained. Microgravity, you get decreased bone mineral density when in space with less gravity. True to some extent, like living at Mount Everest, a little bit less, 20,000 feet. You're going to have some differences there too. May not be as much, but there will be some. Muscle atrophy, certainly out in space we're really talking about here, and cardiovascular deconditioning as well. As little as a few days, you can see dramatic differences here in bone mineral density, muscle atrophy, and cardiovascular conditioning. Primarily the cardiovascular conditioning and the bone mineral density. Muscle atrophy is less, okay? But it does happen, it will happen at least a little bit from being away from any sort of compressive forces with gravity pulling on you. Those are necessary for optimal bone mineral density, for proper bone mineral density, for bone density improvement, as well as proper compressive forces for any pushing type actions with muscles that perform pushing type motions, and cardiovascular conditioning because of the skeletal muscle adaptation to stress from gravity. Okay? That said, it can return and within a couple of weeks, a few weeks of training, all depending on how much time someone's spent in space. But someone who's not well trained, like anything, you don't get a little bit of benefit from a few weeks of training, take time off. The idea of someone training for a few weeks and going into space, never exercised before, you're not going to gain that back in a quick few weeks once you come back. It's going to take you much longer to gain it back because you haven't been training for a long period of time. Your body isn't fully adapted over many months and years, which is what we're really talking about here with the people who can come back from such stressors from space and respond to normal within a couple weeks or so. Okay. Can an athlete be identified at an early age? Yes, from a standpoint of movement skill, standpoint of muscle size differences, mostly from a standpoint of the way the person moves and their conditioning capacity. Elite athlete is a little more difficult, but you can usually tell when you've seen enough people. You've seen enough kids, and you start seeing differences in some kids versus another. I didn't know I was capable of being a good runner until I engaged in some 7 or 8-year-old little event at the community center, and we had they called it a distance run or a cross-country run. It was across 2 baseball fields. It was probably a few hundred yards, a couple of baseball fields, and do a circle around and come back around. I'd be shocked if it was a half a mile. It might have been longer than that. I don't remember for sure. That said, I remember taking off fast. And I remember everybody yelling at me, slow down. And I didn't slow down. I never slowed down. And I beat everybody by a long distance. And it didn't register for me until junior high that I was genetically predisposed to having a much higher endurance capacity than a large majority of people, 99% of people. However, that 1%, it gets really competitive. And so I never was elite high school, good college, never made it past that point. That said, you can tell pretty much early on if there's a higher predisposition towards someone being like that elite high school, elite type of level for potential, certainly for college and above, elite high school and above, you can see that early on. It's possible for someone to be elite at the high school and collegiate levels, certainly without ever showing any signs early age, but you can certainly see greater predisposition toward it by the way people move, and you can certainly take muscle biopsies. I don't know why you want to do that, but you can see it. It's usually the way people move. Coordination, some things are genetic, and genetics can play a role of up to, your book noted, 25 to 50%. Up to 50% of VO2 max strength and power is genetic. And it's really fun when you have seen someone who's an athlete and see them have kids. And I was blessed with some athletic ability, and watching my daughter, and of course I'm biased, of course I am, but watching her run and seeing her run, it's really exciting, going, wow, there's some genetics at play. Just literally, she wasn't running out of the womb, but she was certainly running and runs now at levels where supposedly kids with don't have a lot of glycolytic capacity. And granted, she doesn't have anywhere near what mine is, even though I'm 49. I was a former high-level runner, but still, the mere fact that I have to run hard to keep up with a 4-year-old is impressive stuff. Genetics, right? And elite, we'll see. But certainly elite, you can see differences, especially when you get kids together. Body structures, height, you can only control so much. I will say, in fairness, height is a controllable beyond what we know at the time, but there have been a lot of studies on situations where children, of even from people who were taller or bigger, from a size-wise, mass-wise in a positive way, taller with greater wingspans, whatnot, lower body fats, when children were not well taken care of, if they were given up and to adoption to a bad family or whatever happened in their lives, and they weren't raised with love and care, it's stunted their growth, not just emotionally and spiritually and mentally, but also physically, physiologically, have shorter bodies, shorter wingspans, you name it, less muscle size, pretty interesting, not impressive, interesting and a little scary, right? Which goes to show there's something to be said for a lot of things in life that could play a role, and it's hard to measure, but there are studies that show that. That said, arm span, there's so many differences. You can't say just because someone's 6 foot versus another person that's 6 foot when they're playing volleyball or basketball or some sport where height really matters, they're going to expect the same thing as soon as their arms go up and extend or go out wide and reach out to sides. Someone may have a wingspan that's several inches longer than the other person, the same body height, because that makes a big difference there. Body fat is the one we have the greatest control over here with these particular variables, standpoint of even though you're genetically blessed or cursed, so to speak, with certain body fats, that can be changed dramatically. However, it will require more or less effort depending upon the person's background genetically. Somatotype, the book referred to ectomorph being a typical somatotype for a swimmer, being a combination between a little bit of fat but still lean tissue, like a mesomorph is very muscular, whereas endomorph tends to be more towards more rounded, so to speak, more fat. But that being said, that you're going to see someone who's more elite genetically is going to probably be more ectomorphic, just naturally, unquestionably. And just like you're going to see, typically speaking, a mesomorph for someone who's going to be expected to be a genetically gifted, elite, super elite power athlete or maximal strength, right? That being said, you got to watch those things over time. Proportionality of legs to upper body for wingspan to legs, those will play a role too in certain sports, one versus some sports versus others, and there's only so much you can control with that. That said, there are certain genes that have been found to be likely to be caused why some people have genetic predispositions toward greater capacity for either endurance or maximal strength and power. This ACEID, or angiotensin converting enzyme gene polymorphism, has been found to be consistent with people who have high levels of elite type endurance about 75% of the time. There's always that variable, which is why I'm not a big fan personally. I think it's very interesting to see genetic predispositions. I certainly don't want to be hearing anyone either limit or expect someone to have greater capacity because they have certain genetic predispositions, because there are so many lifestyle factors that will play a greater role toward at least the large majority of performance capacity. When you start going to extremes of elite or extremes of stress, concern, and illness, there are variables there, okay? But those people are really unusual, and we'll see a dramatic difference in them. You'll see a child who seems to eat somewhat normally and play around, but still they have significant body fat when they're 8, 9, 10 years old. That's definitely someone who's more likely to have challenges when they get older. It doesn't mean they're cursed with that weight forever, though. I got after a couple of you, not get after, wrong choice of words, but I want to make sure you understood when you talked about genetic predisposition toward someone being overweight or someone towards having more ACTN3, like actinin alpha 3 gene, more towards maximal speed and power, or the angiotensin converting enzyme gene polymorphism for endurance. It doesn't mean that they're going to be a better endurance athlete or better power athlete, or that someone's going to have going to be fat when they get older. But there are predispositions, and that is as simple as that. It means be aware, be ready for possibly giving more effort toward certain aspects of what we expect in performance. Okay. Now, for us to be able to tie together this right here is a big deal from a standpoint of things you take with you from this class, from exercise physiology in general. Tying someone's goal from a performance standpoint to the energy system, to the fiber type they're using, to the fitter variables, and how we program. And of course, when someone's getting ready for a competition, when we taper, we're talking about as little as 3 days of taper for someone who doesn't need to have that much of a downturn and reducing stress in the short term, getting ready for performance, up to about 14 days. Going 21 days and beyond is a lot. And the athletes that can get away with longer tapers are typically more of the power type athletes, strength athletes, whereas the endurance type athletes don't want to be spending too much time off because you can maintain strength and power better over time away than you can cardiovascular conditioning. Okay. That being said, so talk about speed athletes, power athletes, agility, strength, primary focus points. Our energy system primarily is ATP-CP. Muscle fiber type, typically predominantly type 2X. When we say approximate all for the fitter variables, how often should you train? About every 72 to 96 hours. When the goal is maximal speed, power, agility, strength, you don't train this way every day, every 3 or 4 days. That's your frequency. 95 to 100% force output, maximal output, right? We're talking 140% plus VO2 max. I don't like referring to VO2 max for this type of training, but if you were going to do it, that should be looking at really high, well above 100% VO2 max, because VO2 max is your performance for 10 to 12 minutes, right? And then you have RPE is going to be probably really high. Don't confuse the RPE with the very first set with the RPE in your final sets. You may be given maximal effort, but it won't necessarily feel like a 9 or 10 RPE. You feel pretty good your first set or two. You keep doing it, you're going to have RPE, your rate of perceived exertion is going to be increasing naturally, and you can't go above 10, right? That said, heart rate's going to be highly variable, going to be increasing over time. We don't want to expect a heart rate ever. Don't get to a certain heart rate. We've mentioned this before. We should never set a floor for getting a heart rate while training. Set ceilings, don't go above blank heart rate, that's reasonable. You might want to depend, that's going to depend very much on the person. I've never really set ceilings from a standpoint of something like this kind of training because you're not typically engaging for efforts for longer than a few seconds. That should not be a factor. If someone gets their heart rate 180, 190, 200 and above for a few seconds, kind of wonder what's really going on if your heart rate gets that high in a power sport, or it's in a maximal competitive situation where that's different. Okay, and it's very brief and it doesn't happen again. It happens because it's your big performance, and then you don't do any more sets. You're done, right? The variable or the type itself is variable. What tool are you using when you train? Are you talking about for someone who's on land running? Talking about someone who's in the water swimming? You're talking about someone who's on a bike cycling? Talking about someone lifting weights? A lot of variables. So the type is always a variable in so many factors. From a general standpoint, for performance as a whole, whenever they're on the ground, unless we're trying to be a better pool water athlete or a better cyclist, you're better off, or someone on the ice. As another example, there's always exceptions. You want people on the land to get better on the land of all aspects of sport, okay? Of all aspects of training, first and foremost. Train on stable, flat ground until you worry about any other form of training, okay? That said, 1 to 10 seconds work because that's about how long it takes for creatine phosphate stores to dwindle significantly enough before glycolysis begins to kick in. There's a variable there. It could go much as 30 seconds. Some books refer to as much as 30 seconds for creatine phosphate. That's fair. Here we're going to call it 10 seconds. So that's your time under tension. Your set's 1 to 10 seconds long. Your time under tension, or time in general. Rest, 3 to 5 minutes. Why 3 to 5 minutes? Most people take about 3 minutes up to 5 minutes to regain 100% ATP for the skeletal muscle cells. As little as 90 seconds for elite athletes. And that's your rest. There's the fitter principles. There's your fiber type. There's your energy system. There's your goal. That's pretty awesome stuff. Have it all together in one place like that. Okay. These are not exact. They're pretty good variables though. And you will get some questions on your exam with some of this content here, and it's not going to be something like, is it 1 to 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, or 4 to 5 minutes? That's ridiculous. It's going to be a little more obvious, but you better know it, okay? And I'll give you again for your exam this time around coming up here, your third exam, I will give you the questions. I'm going to flat out give them to you, okay? High intensity interval training, HIIT or hypertrophy, anything you're doing high level anaerobic type training that's not maximal speed, power, agility focused. We're talking about glycolysis, typically speaking. And that said, type 2A fibers, your predominant muscle fiber type used. Approximately every 48, 72 hours, every 2 to 3 days, you're doing this stuff. 70 to 90%, 5% force output expectation, about 120% plus VO2 max, give or take. 8 to 10 RPE, not an exact, but roughly speaking. Heart rate, again, not something you expect, By your last sets, yes, heart rate will be up. Don't try to get the heart rate up. Set maximal values though, don't get above certain heart rates, okay? Variable type, again, 10 seconds to 2 minutes work time, that's pretty accurate for being predominantly glycolytic. Somewhere in the 10-30 seconds time frame, glycolysis kicks in as the primary energy system, and somewhere around 2 minutes, maybe up to 3 minutes, it becomes the primary energy system again. For untrained, genetically non-blessed people, you might see them going more aerobic as little as 90 seconds, more aerobic, even earlier, possibly 75 seconds, more aerobic than anaerobic around that time frame. For genetically gifted, well-trained athletes with high aerobic capacities and anaerobic capacities, both to some extent, you're going to see someone not go predominantly aerobic until after 2 minutes. Okay, they're going to be maybe up closer to 3 minutes even, for some. That said, rest period is 30 to 90 seconds because you don't need full ATP. You should be able to get 70% ATP in 30 seconds, expect 90% ATP in about 90 seconds. So your rest period is probably going to be short for the work period is short for the long rest periods. When your work period is going longer, then your rest period needs to be shorter because you're going to be working at longer periods at lesser intensities. Okay, but that said, you have to expect a downturn in output. It's a simple fact. Too many people try to do long work periods and give short rest periods and expect amazing outputs. It doesn't work like that. Okay? ATP replenishment, again, is 70 to 90%, and that's why. Strength endurance, cardiovascular endurance, skill type training, movement skill, just moving better as a whole. We're talking about mostly oxidative phosphorylation. Type 1 muscle fiber is dominant. About every 24 to 48 hours, every 1 to 2 days, this kind of training, which means on days where you're going between your maximal speed, power, agility stuff or your high intensity intervals are your strength, endurance, skill type training days. Okay, this could be every day, some of this stuff for skill or strength, endurance type work. We're talking about sub 70% force output, maybe as low as 60, 65%, or even 55% for some people where they're already starting to go anaerobic. So it's pretty low intensity for some people. Maximally 70% force output, we'd say generally for the elite athletes, okay? When we're doing predominantly aerobic type work, That said, up to about 100% V2 max, right? Up to 8 RPE, give or take. Don't confuse that with you're engaging in an endurance event where you're going as hard as you can. After several minutes, your RPE is going to start climbing up to 10. It's going to do it. You're giving everything you got, but there's only so much you've got because you're going from a standpoint of if you push too hard, you're going to bonk and you're going to falter altogether. So to be able to maintain your pace, you can't push too hard. So your RPE is still fairly high, but your output is actually dropping. You don't have any choice. Don't confuse RPE with actual output. They are not the same. That's why we take them both so we understand more what's going on, right? Excuse me again. Being stuck at home and not talking a lot in class and then doing a long video can make it where the need for water is much, much higher. That said, 2+ minutes work for time under tension for aerobic activity, it's going to be longer, right? You can go shorter, but it's kind of hard to get aerobic benefit unless you're going at least 2 minutes or beyond to fully get into the oxidative phosphorylation energy system. And we talked a lot about 20 minutes and beyond for really maximizing our expectations for aerobic capacity towards VO2 max and whatnot. Okay, our lactate threshold, at least 15-20 minutes. That said, 0 to 30 seconds rest because you're not looking for full ATP. Maybe it's no rest at all. It's a steady state type run. Remember we talked about a couple of chapters ago talking about sprints. The book referred to sprints with 30 seconds, up to 30 seconds work and a short rest period. Like that's not a sprint to me. That's something that's like a low intensity work period, which doesn't make a lot of sense. 30-30 might be something, I don't know where you'd even see that in many sports. What sports do you go for 30 seconds work and 30 seconds rest on a regular basis? I can't think of any, honestly, where you do that. They're usually much longer work periods with short rest periods, or they're much shorter work periods with about that rest period a little bit longer. That being said, when the rest period is short or the work period is long, and that happens consistently, the work becomes more aerobic, right? If the rest period is short, with repeated sets, the work becomes more and more toward aerobic oxidation or oxidative phosphorylation the more you do work, okay? And we're only looking for about 70% ATP replenishment. That's why you don't need more than about 30 seconds rest. Nutrient quality and timing. And I'll leave it up to your nutrition course to cover this in great depth. We could easily cover this in so much depth here, but let's talk about a few things. What should I eat pre-training? High carbohydrate, about 70 to 80%, moderate protein, about 10-20%, low fat, 10% or less, about 1 to 2 hours before you train is recommended, as much as 3 for some people prior to training. You want to make sure you bonk and get tired? Good, don't eat the carb. Okay, people got to eat the carbohydrate. Every single time I've ever trained anyone who complains about fatigue and feeling worn down, I make sure they're eating that level of carbohydrate before they work out. We find the right type of food for them, and all of a sudden they go, I feel so much better. Shocker. Your body needs carbohydrate for anything that's high intensity interval type training or above if we're going to be expecting you to engage in activity for any lengthy period of time at all. Okay, vitamins B and C are water soluble, and excess is going to be excreted. Okay, so when you're peeing, that's what you're getting. You're peeing out. You see that bright colors. It's difficult to take too much from the standpoint of your B's and your C's. But that being said, high carbohydrate, you can take too much, certainly. Protein, you can certainly take too much. You got to be careful how much you take of these things. What should eat for his intake post-training? If your training is high intensity, 70% or 5% or higher VO2 max or similar output for 45, 60 minutes or more, you should be taking the carb protein shake in 30 to 90 minutes following training. Some people say right away, if you take it inside of 30 minutes, post-training, if your goal is maximal strength or power, you're going to actually potentially limit growth hormone and limit insulin-like growth factor and limit your growth potential. So you don't want to probably do that if the goal is to maximize maximal speed, power, agility, that kind of thing. Okay, for endurance athletes, we're not worried about it. You could drink that carb protein shake right after the fact. We're not worried about the great growth hormone release, specifically post-training. Okay, and the ratio from carb protein is about 3 or 4 to 1. Okay. Eat a whole meal, another 1 to 2 hours after that carb protein shake for post-workout. That's ideal. Do that, and we're going to resupply our glycogen levels and help recover from stress, get ourselves responding to better tissue repair so that we can train again sooner, which is the goal, right? Want to make sure you don't recover well, don't eat, right? How long do nutrients taken in isolation require to break down and be utilized? Assuming you only ate carb. You're looking at the most complex carbs with the lowest glycemic index on the light glycemic index scale could give you nutrients up to 60 minutes. Okay, whereas the higher the glycemic index, generally speaking, and the lower the complexity of the carbohydrate, more toward monosaccharide, and less you eat of it for that matter, you could be going through that in a few minutes. That being said, you want to make it last longer, eat protein with it. Protein itself takes 1 to 2 hours to break down, which is why you don't want to take protein in right before training. We're not talking about liquid form of things. Liquid form has to break down faster, but we still got to be careful with, and I'm going to question when people talk about taking in protein during training. I think you're going to be asking for lacking capacity for handling proper workloads while taking in during training. Everybody's a little bit different, and a power type athlete is going to get away with that a lot more, but an endurance type athlete or someone doing glycolytic type work would never recommend someone even touch protein during training, during the training time itself. Pre, post, sure, not during. And of course, fat, you want to be looking at 3 to 5 hours for breakdown. So consequently, if you're taking a bunch of fat in, expect to not be training at high intensities for at least 3 to 5 hours. Okay. How do you maintain high insulin sensitivity with proper excretion from food? Eat more complex, lower glycemic index carbohydrates. Carbs are not the problem why people have diabetes. The wrong carbohydrates, the wrong timing. They're not getting the proper glycemic index. They're not getting the proper complexity. They're not exercising regularly, which is the bigger issue altogether, really. About 80-90% of carbohydrate should be your lower glycemic index complex carbohydrates. Eat protein or fat with your foods. That lowers the insulin-like response. Consequently, you're not going to have the issue with insulin, and at least the same level. And eating whole foods, real foods, right? As close to natural as possible, so to speak. Doesn't mean you don't cook them. Some foods actually you get less nutrients from without going into great detail on this one. Some foods you get more nutrients. Your body gleans more from them. A lot of vegetables, by the way, a lot of carbohydrates in general, complex carbohydrates too. You cook them, your body breaks it down more easily, takes less from you trying to break it down digestive-wise. You actually get more nutrients by cooking it first. Okay, you'll need to look more on that. There's a lot of foods like that. You need to do more research there for that. That said, ergogenic aids, something like caffeine for people looking at getting a little boost, assuming they're eating right already. Why are we looking at ergogenic aids if we don't already eat well? That said, caffeine for some peaks between 15 to 60 minutes after diet ingestion. Okay, so if you're expecting a caffeine boost, take it 15 to 60 minutes before you need it. Must be well hydrated and rested to avoid chronic adrenal dysfunction. That's the biggest problem why people say they're tired, I don't get the same caffeine boost anymore. You've actually tapped your adrenal glands. Okay, your adrenal glands actually are basically shut, their function is actually inhibited with caffeine, or by a standpoint on a chronic basis, because you're actually basically opening the floodgates, blocking the adrenal receptors, and so constantly your body secretes adrenaline, epinephrine, right, on a high basis when you take in caffeine. That said, if your body starts getting less and less of a boost, the same stuff you're taking in, you got to take a break. Okay, you got to more specifically going here, there we go, taking basically going off caffeine for at least 7 days to optimize the effect again. 3 weeks on, 7 days off, most research says is your best, choice for caffeine utilization. Okay, maximization, I should say. Can aid performance, mental focus, increased alertness, CNS stimulant. It can help some maximal speed, maximal power type work to some extent, but it really can help a lot with the endurance type work significantly. Okay, creatine monohydrate peaks between 15 to 60 minutes after ingestion as well, very similar to caffeine. You still have to be making sure you're well hydrated to avoid side effects of stomach cramping and digestive issues. It's particularly effective for glycolysis. Some creatine phosphate type work too, so certainly that 20-30 second time frame, absolutely, going up to about 60 seconds. Somewhere in that 30-60 seconds time frame is really where you're maximizing performance. Hypertrophy, of course, significant benefits here. High intensity interval training, and some strength, of course, too, for sure. Okay, some speed work too, but generally speaking, you see the most in that rough time frame there. Also, something like beta alanine, a lot of people don't consider very much. You really should consider it for some athletes who are engaging in more endurance type performance. Precursor for the synthesis of carnosine, which aids buffering of hydrogen ions. And when you're trying to engage in high intensity interval training or aerobic type work, that's extremely important. Create significant tingling or burning skin sensation and shakiness if you take in too much, and increase the muscle buffering capacity though by 3 to 5%. That's dramatic for an elite athlete. It's effective in glycolytic work for 1 to 3 minutes in particular, with some performance improvements as high as 12 to 14%. That's some good stuff right there. Okay, taking about 3 to 5 grams per day, very similar to creatine monohydrate intake. And I should say caffeine has typically been investigated for about 150 to about 400 milligrams with a sitting for people to get the performance benefit, but doesn't mean everybody should take 400 milligrams of caffeine, does it? Sodium bicarbonate, this is a very interesting one. A lot of people haven't tried baking soda essentially, or other similar buffers like some other phosphates that you can take in as well, can do similar things. And increases extracellular buffering capacity, which what your body's trying to do anyway internally, but you can actually enhance it by actually ingesting sodium bicarbonate. You just have to be careful with it. It can cause some gastric issues. I've done it, messing around with it, just on my own training post-college to see what it would do. And you end up spending an awful lot of time in the restroom if you're not careful, and you can actually cause some serious distress to your digestive system if you weren't careful on how you took it on a regular basis. But can reduce hydrogen ion interference significantly. No question, it takes longer to fatigue, helping with improve your lactate threshold and actually enable to perform at higher levels for more glycolytic type work in particular, and some aerobic type work. Cause moderate to severe gastrointestinal distress, however, and that said, probably about 60 seconds of work or beyond is probably the most helpful, and by as much as 2 to 8% in performance improvement. Pretty interesting stuff. I wouldn't suggest you take any of those ergogenic aids unless you have a proper diet in your background. We'll talk about some of these concepts a little bit more. There just isn't enough time class-wise, information beyond this. If you're interested in looking into more from what you found here in any area we cover in our topics, we're talking about a little bit more with training and some of the concepts, try and tying things together. One more lecture video for us on Wednesday. But if you have questions, comments, things you'd like me to cover in our final video, please let me know, and let's see if I can put some stuff in there. Otherwise, I will love to direct you in any direction you want for more information down the road beyond the topics we covered in class and the sources we have looked into thus far. There's always more questions, but ultimately, hopefully, you're satisfied with the level of improvement you've been able to make with your efforts, and I've been very impressed by your efforts, and thank you so much for that. I'll thank you again one more time, but hey, got to get it in when you can, right? That said, I will look forward to talking to you again very soon, one more time.